Hello everyone, Kultured Khun here. This is a continuation of the series Afro Saxon. And so far we've discussed doctrinally what an Afro Saxon is, we've spoken socially, and now we're going to talk politically. Now, before I go on to discuss, dissect, and deliberate on the definition of politics and power, I just want to lay out the plan of action as far as this video follows. So today we're going to be discussing power and its distribution across the political spectrum, okay? And power, essentially by definition, is the ability or the capacity to affect or to influence an outcome or the behaviors of others. So when you are in political power, you are in the position to positively or negatively affect the affairs of a state, the affairs of a nation, the effects of an area of land in which people are living. Now, in Africa, we come from patronage. So we are the progeny of patronage. We come from a society of kings, queens, chiefs, chieftainesses. And what that means with our political structures is we are very used to the idea of centralized power because we existed with monarchies for the longest time. So here in Zambia, the 7 major tribes, we have the Bemba, Luvale, Kaonde, Chewa, Lozi, Lenje, and Tonga people. And these people initially, before we had interactions with the white people, who came and introduced new ideologies into our systems, had the monopoly of power and decision making within their families, and this power would be passed down to their predecessors. And now you see these similar structures in Europe as well. They have their own royal families who in the past were responsible for the policy making and the governance of the people in their kingdom. Okay. Now, with the migration and the movement from rural to urban areas and also the influx of new ideology from the Europeans, we moved away and learned apart from these systems. So with colonization came the new ideology of elections and elects. And the idea of elect comes from electus in Latin, which means to pick, okay? And oftentimes the systems which are governing our lives today were built on these principles of elections, electus, okay? Now, politica in the Greek, again, has to do with the affairs of the city. And a republic comes from Latin, again, from Rome. And this was the idea of having elected representatives act as your proxy in those power struggles. So you would elect, you'd cast a vote, and you'd give over your administrative, your legislative, and your financial governance systems to people who you believe would serve your best interest. In the pure sense, democracy, which in the Greek, which a lot of people think runs our systems, has more involvement of the people. So everyone, demos means people, krasi means rule of. So the rule of the people, typically in ancient Greece, in Athens actually, you found that in those practiced democracies, not just theoretical, but practical, it translated into real life, that everyone would have a vote. And that means everyone would have a say in dictating the pace at which changes came to their community. What we have in Africa and largely across the world is a republic, where we have representatives or elects who discuss, dissect, and deliberate on our issues, the issues which we offer up to them. And for the most part, we hope they represent our best interests. But unfortunately, as you know, in Africa and also across the world, that people are corruptible. And when people are corruptible, people game the system. So oftentimes you find that in Africa, people appoint themselves via the divine right of kings. So we do have this idea that certain people are gifted by God, which may be true to a certain extent. We do believe in the anointed ones. And with that being said, you find that a lot of our politicians may not be apt enough, may not even be qualified or skilled enough to position themselves to represent us, but do so anyway. And the reason why they do that is maybe because they have the resource to do so. So in Africa, there is this current idea floating around that to become politically active, first you have to be economically empowered. And the issue with marrying the two, the political spectrum and the economic engine of the world, is that not everyone who's made money has the best ideas, and not everyone with the best ideas has the most money. So what you find is when people form these political parties, they're having to pander towards the people who are pushing into their pockets, the people who have their hands in their pockets. Because what a lot of people not to know is a political party is a private organization. And with that private organization, there's stakeholders. And not only stakeholders, but shareholders as well. So that means if you and I are both part of a political party and you offer them R1,000,000 or R1,000,000 kwacha or R1,000,000 pula or R1,000,000 of whatever it is, and I offer them R100, R100 pula, R100 or 100 kwacha, the party are going to listen to you. They're going to pander towards you. So when it comes to lobbying for legislature, when it comes to pushing for certain policies, they're going to be more likely to bend to your will because you have the lifeblood. And unfortunately, in this world we live in, capital is the lifeblood of most organizations, of most foundations. And we find that political structures, our political systems, our political regimes are often having to contort, conform, and bend themselves towards the will of others. They often have to break their backs, and we break our own backs for the approval of the people with the pocket power. Correct? So there is this corruption from the economic side of politics, but I want to talk purely in the abstract sense because that's what politics is essentially. Politics is meant to be the free flow of ideas and ideas that have the potential to change the reality of the people who are governed by those ideas. So politics, whether it's in parliament, whether it's in the Senate, whether it's in councils, whether it's amongst tribal lands, whether it's in kingdoms, has to do with the discourse of the demos. So the conversation of the people. And ultimately, this conversation dictates how we rule the people. Okay? So we transitioned from kingdoms and then we moved on to a republic. But we use the wrong word as far as democracy, because democracy in the pure sense speaks for everyone. And if you're an African, then you know that the largest demographic are women. Demos, again, people, graphic, written, or drawn. So demographically, as far as a data study of the people, the largest group are women. And not just any women, young women. So if you wanted a purely representative democracy in our states, we'd have to have the largest group being women, and the largest group of that being young women. But obviously we know as time has passed that that's not exactly the case. So therefore we failed either to grasp the concept of these terms that we use and we coin, or to translate these ideologies into action. Because that's the truth of an idea, is when you translate into action, what does it show? Okay. Now, we can't dismiss the political discourse around gender because it is important. And I want to speak to the history of the wisdom keepers of Africa traditionally. The wisdom keepers were women, and elderly women at that. And even with our council or our tribal leadership, you find it was women in these positions who influenced the outcomes before the European came to us. Now, with the modernization of Africa, with the integration of European ideology, you found that we've spun out of control and we are oftentimes victim to the value systems and views and the beliefs being pushed onto us by the powers who have actually practiced democracy and republics for a longer time than we have. You see, with America and a lot of the G7 countries and the influence in Africa, it is a lot to do with the economics, because they fund a lot of these parties. They fund the dissension, they fund the conflict, they fund the war, they fund the poverty, they fund the disease, they fund the famine. And what you find is that African leaders are stuck in this position of playing revolutionary or lapdog to the West. You find that when Africans choose themselves and choose to gain control over their resources, the Patrice Lumumbas, they send back a tooth. The Kwame Nkrumahs, they kill the people. The Nelson Mandelas, they imprison you. The Kenneth Kaundas, it's very serious implications to being politically active or politically involved in the discourse that governs the demos, again, the people. And I want to speak to being a youth, a politically active youth, even though I would consider myself apolitical now. It is very difficult to push a narrative or to even gain traction of positive ideology in Zambia. And it's part of the reason why I started BOZA, Build One Zambia. is because I feel there's a desperate need to retrain and recalibrate the minds to operate off a positive campus, to have positive consensus building through conversation that catalyzes change ultimately. And I don't think this can happen if we're not honest, because I think on a base level, where we start to impact change in later lives is with ourselves. So relationship with self and knowledge of self brings about love, and then love of self brings about fulfillment in society. And if we start by healing the person inside, and you heal the mind, and you heal the heart, and you heal the soul, you then begin to heal others, you know? And it's interesting, politics, because it does my head in all the time. You know, I come from a well-known political family, and so I'm well versed in the conversations floating around the political arena, positive, negative, or otherwise. And some of the conversations I've had with our supposed elites or elects, some of who've been my family members, obviously they won't tell me everything, but you really start to realize the disparity in engagement between those who really know how the system works and those who don't. You know, for oftentimes you see Zambians get really riled up and voting for people based off a false promise, based off a dream they've been sold, but they never ever considered what is the alternative to that dream. How can I hold you in accountability for what you told me? You know, because people produce manifestos, they produce challenges against ruling parties, but then proceed to do the same. And you find that our politicians nowadays across the African continent are oftentimes the managerial incumbents of the imperialist system. They end up being the guard dogs of the fiat system, which has oppressed us and controlled us. And you find that those who control this information, those who control the media, those who control the means by which we can express ourselves politically, economically, even to a certain extent, are not African. And so democratically, politically, again, that speaks to being an Afro Saxon. Because if we are indigenous people and we indigenize our knowledge system and we learn from the past and we act based off our normative customs and values, then you cannot be swayed by the Western rule or even the Eastern rule. Because now we have China imposing themselves as well in our political spectrum. And so in the US and the UK, you have left and right and up and down and so on and so forth. But in Africa, in large part, we vote based off class. We vote based off economics. And even being informed or a learning youth, despite being majority of the population, you find that you don't have a voice. You know, and when you try to have a voice, you find that you bump your head across barriers to entry. No, you're too young. No, you don't have enough money. No, who are you? No, who do you think you are? No, you think you know everything. And these are some of the challenges I've found, because I've tried to be politically active. I've tried to have petitions started. I've tried to have movements pushed. I've tried to have businesses opened. You know, I've literally been knocking on the doors, going the right way. And you find that when you try to do things the right way, it's so much difficult than doing things the corrupt way. The status quo of business here, business particularly in politics, with the flow and the information and the movement of ideas, it's so corrupt, you know, and granted people are corruptible, granted people aren't perfect, and they build systems which are imperfect themselves. But I think we really need to have a critical conversation of what it means to be an African politically. Because for me, we find that we have the blind leading the blind. You have people who are young enough, or should I say old enough, to vote, but they're not old enough to dictate who they vote for. You find that you're given a limited range of options, and then you are governed by the tyranny of choice, because you have to choose between lesser evils. You know this person doesn't listen to their children at home, but then again, the children of Zambia make up over 60% of the population. So how are you going to vote for someone who doesn't listen to children on a micro scale, when the decisions you make will affect children on a macro scale? And I don't mean children as far as tweens, I mean children as far as the vast majority of the voting public from 18 to 35 are children in large part, at least as termed or conditioned by Africans. And so you find that you are old enough to vote, but not old enough to tell them or to keep them in check. Because I often ask my parents, it's interesting that we as Africans call ourselves democratic. I said, democratic how? Because at which point do you practice democracy? Nothing about an African lifestyle is democratic. You don't dictate the outcomes of your household. You don't even dictate the school you go to. You don't dictate the thoughts you have. You don't dictate what you say around them. So how then are you going to be empowered to dictate the outcomes of governance systems which rule over your life and also your parents' life? So you're young enough to serve as cannon fodder for the political spectrum, but you're not young enough to dictate the outcomes of a household. Interesting. We're young enough to vote, we're young enough to riot, we're young enough to protest, we're young enough to cause trouble. But when it comes of causing meaningful, purposeful change, driving initiatives and action, which would disrupt the status quo, you're too young. You're not mature enough. You see the hypocrisy here. And so I want to speak to the delineation of power, because we do, I think, are still governed by that divine right of kings. And, even in my own debates, discussions, rebuttals with some of these more senior political officials, you find that a lot of what they say doesn't hold water. And the reason why it doesn't hold water is because they know they're acting as a proxy, a puppet for the profit of a system, another system, i.e. the first world, which governs our system. Because a lot of the legislature, a lot of the administrative functions are overseen and were taught to us by the West. A lot of people don't actually know, with our freedom fighters in 1964, Kenneth Kaunda, the people who helped actually build our institutions and harness our knowledge and human capital were the West. I believe the chancellor was the vice chancellor of the University of Zambia, the first university of Zambia, the Zambia's most prized public asset at the time, was headed in part by a white person. And now this is not to divide us along religious lines or race lines, but just to show that even the systems which were built for you, supposedly by you, still had a Western influence. And that just shows that our people, on a base level, never understood the mechanics of the machine they were inheriting or the machine they were trying to build. Because some of the problems we're facing today has to do with those shaky foundations. And I don't want to be here complaining about, oh no, they don't understand, no, I have the answers to everything. I'm an academic for the most part, so I read a lot, I write, I discuss, I engage in these discussions. But that doesn't mean I have all the answers. And you can check these facts for yourself. You can check in the 1950s and 60s, who were building your institutions, who were building your banks, who were building your supermarkets, who were building your hospitals, who was in charge of your manufacturing and distribution, who was in charge of the information dissemination, who really controls what the people think, what the people say, and what the people do. And those are the questions I want you to ask. So we've discussed, as Africans, we come from a traditional heritage of kingship, kingdoms, monarchy, monarchical rule. We are the progeny of patronage. As Afro Saxons, we're smack bang in the middle of revolutionary systems from the Romans and the Greeks, which were then polluted and made perverse by the West. And as they came here and supposedly taught us, enlightened us to the ideas of democracy, political freedom of movement, we found that these systems don't work for us because at a basic level, we don't believe in them. At a basic level, we don't understand them. But at an even more basic level, we don't know what they are. What does it mean to cast a vote? To cast a vote means to give over, to outsource your administrative, legislative authority to another person who is meant to be an ambassador of your opinions, your values, your beliefs. They're meant to be a flagship carrier. They are meant to carry you to the promised land. They're meant to be your Moses. They're meant to be your David. But that's just not the case. And it breaks my heart because I would have liked to become politically involved. I would have liked to put forward my efforts to profit the people. I would have liked to sacrifice at the hands of the system for the prosperity of the people. I would have loved that. But it would be irresponsible of me, knowing what I know and knowing how things work, to ever get involved in a system like that, which takes advantage of the poor, which doesn't even represent its people, which subjects itself to the tyranny and oppression of youths. And yeah, so this comes with the adverse effects of being learned or wise or applying knowledge to life. Is that you find yourself oftentimes in impossible places. And politically, as far as, the ideation of freedom, the ideation of prosperity, it's unfortunate because most politicians aren't driven by these ideals. Most politicians are driven by their pockets. Most politicians choose politics because it is the proven path to prosperity. And you see that oftentimes. People buying zebras, giraffes, European sports cars, while people are dying every day because they have nothing to eat. They're dying every day because they've been put in prison for speaking against the tyranny, speaking against the oppression, speaking against the systematic slavery most of us are in. I'm sorry this video got a bit emotional, but it's politics is something that's pained my heart for a long time. Having been in it, having been the son of a prominent politician, the grandson of an even more prominent politician, there's things of this game that I know that would break most people. There's things I've seen done to my family, my friends, my associates, myself even. There's things we've been through, which just makes a fuss of what it is we believe is politics or politicking or the political spectrum in Zambia. So with that being said, I hope you guys as Zambians learn how to maneuver the machine, which is the political spectrum. I hope that you become more learned, you read the constitution, you pick up a book or a ledger, or ask someone to translate for you, ask someone to explain to you the positions and how they apply to your life. Whether it's councillor, whether it's an MP, whether it's a mayor, whether it's a permanent secretary, whether it's a minister, whether it's a president. Learn these definitions, learn these positions, learn the privileges, learn the supposed power, learn the influence and how they dictate the outcomes of your life. Learn how free you might be to think or say what you wish. Learn that your value as a person, your thoughts are worth more than a penny. And you shouldn't be dictated to simply because you lack the resource to. You shouldn't have to be an oligarch to put forth your foot in the world and to impact the people around you for the better. And you as a youth, if you're looking to be politically involved, learn, research, read, write, listen. Pick up as much information as you can so that you can order an attack against the system. If you're someone like me and you're wishing to break the system, you have to learn the ins and outs of the system. You have to have agents serving in the system. And even then it won't be enough because you still need to organize resources to go against the system, which was built primarily to service the needs of the few. And those few being the colonial governors, those few being the Cecil John Rose and the British South African Company and the British Royal Family and the Vatican. Those few who benefit off your blind ignorance to the ideas being passed on to you. Those few who push policies that pervert your philosophies, that pervert your personhood, that push down your needs to the bottom of the food chain in favor of those with the most money, those with the fatter pockets. Learn. And with that being said, Cultured Khun out.